Carried to the Government House Leader Senate.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I must admit, when I first came here today, I didn't realize that we would be discussing such an important topic, but I'm glad that we are. I think that there are a number of recommendations in this report from the Finance Committee that is being concurred in at this point, and I'm very much looking forward to talking about some of the recommendations in here. I'm going to focus my conversations on really two areas that I have great interest in that are referenced in this report. The first would be with respect to electric vehicles and electrifying our grid. The second is with respect to fossil fuel subsidies and a recommendation in here that references those specifically. First of all, in prelude to my conversation around electric vehicles and the incentivications that are in this report and the recommendations that are in this report, I think it's important to reflect on where this country and indeed developed nations have come in terms of electric vehicles and zero-emission vehicles more generally speaking. It's worth noting that in 2017, only 1% of vehicles that were registered in Canada were considered electric vehicles. By 2019, that was at 2.9%. And by 2022, in the first quarter of 2022, it was at 7.7% and is said to be as high as 10%. So that means that at 10% of the vehicles currently being registered right now are electric vehicles. This is important. This is very important, and I will attempt to explain why, Mr. Speaker. If people are familiar with the 5 stages of technological adoption, they're probably familiar with the bell curve that talks about the diffusion of new technologies. And basically what you have, Mr. Speaker, is at the front end of that bell curve, you have the first 2.5% of people. These are the innovators. These are the people that go out and buy things because they genuinely believe in them. They're willing to pay, exorbitant amounts of money because often they can in order for to be the first people to have these new technologies. After that, the next 13.5%, Mr. Speaker, are the early adopters. These are the people that buy things for the purposes of, believing in the cause. They're starting to see a price point that works for their budget, and they go out and they buy them. After that, you have the early majority. These are people who are basically buying because this is 34% of the people that are buying because they've seen other people do it and now they want to do it. You have the late majority. These are the people that are buying because they pretty much have to at this point. And then at the very end, the last, I believe it's 15 or 16%, are the laggards. And these are basically the people that have to buy it because they have no other choice than to buy the technology that everybody else has adopted. Why I bring this up, Mr. Speaker, is because at 10%, we are past the halfway point through the early adopters. And once you hit 15%, the threshold between the early adopters and the early majority, that's the tipping point. Once you hit that point in terms of market penetration, you will see everything start to move very quickly. And so if we can say that 10% of the vehicles right now that are being registered in Canada, as of right now, are electric vehicles, we're only 5% away from that tipping point. Once we hit that tipping point, things will move very, very quickly. And so I think it is incumbent upon government to be prepared for this. It is coming. It's going to happen. We know that there's an EV revolution. We know that we need to revolutionize the way that we produce and store and transmit electricity. And that's why I was very glad to see a number of recommendations in this report that specifically speak to that. Anybody who has heard me speak in this House around this subject knows that I'm very passionate about electric vehicles, and I'll speak to it just about any opportunity that I have. But it's important because we have the ability to tackle a very important problem. We have the ability on an individual level to tackle a very important issue, and that is obviously climate change. I'm very proud of the fact that there are industries setting up right around my community, Kingston and the Islands. The first would be Umicore, which is actually in a neighboring riding that's represented by a Conservative member in this House. That's Hastings, Lennox and Addington. Umicore is a European-based company that has chosen to come to Ontario in her riding, and great credit to the folks in her riding who were able to do the incredible work to attract this multi-billion-dollar company to Hastings, Lennox and Addington. They are going to be building the largest battery manufacturing facility for electric vehicles in North America. Something like $5 billion in Hastings, Lennox and Addington, just outside of my riding to the west of me. And I think that this is incredible, because as we see these new technologies developing, as we see these more and more people being interested in electric vehicles, Canada has the opportunity to be at the forefront of this. We have the opportunity to be ahead of this. We have the opportunity to export the technology once it's being developed here. And so it's very important. It's very important for our area, but it's also very important for the country. The other aspect to this, because quite often the argument when I get into discussions with people, whether through social media or in person, about electric vehicles is, well, what about the mining and the lithium and all the negative environmental impacts that go into the production of the required elements in order to make these batteries? That is extremely harmful to the environment, is the ongoing narrative. And I'm not going to stand here and try to dismiss that. I think that those are valid concerns. But what I can say, Mr. Speaker, is there's another industry that's starting to emerge in our country, another industry that has one of the first plants to do this, is located in my riding. If you can believe this, Mr. Speaker, in the northern part of Kingston, we call it in Kingston north of Princess, because Princess Street is the dividing line pretty much between our city. There's an old industrial area. I mean old, like going back to the 40s and 50s, like original industrial area in Kingston, outside of the shipyard building that was more along the water. And in this area, there is a company called Li-Cycle that has started to recycle lithium batteries. They receive lithium batteries from throughout the country. These are at end of life for electric vehicles, or a vehicle's been in an accident and the vehicle's written off. All these batteries, there are actually only two facilities in Canada that are doing this right now, using different technologies, one being in my riding, one being on the West Coast. And they take these batteries and can recycle up to 97 or 98% of that battery. So, and they can create a brand new or they can break it down into the elements in order to create brand new EV batteries. So, unlike fossil fuels, Mr. Speaker, where we extract oil out of the ground, refine it, produce gasoline that we fill up our tanks, and once it's burned, it's gone, creates CO2, and it's in the atmosphere. Unlike that, once an EV battery hits its end of life, it can now be transferred and broken down into the original elements to make a new battery using 97% of that original battery. And so I think that it is very telling about what the technologies have to offer as we move into the future. So Li-Cycle is another great success story. It's actually where the Prime Minister chose to bring the President of the European, the EU, the European Union, when she came to visit a couple weeks ago, to this facility in my riding. Of which, I should note, they are now expanding because the current location is too small, and they're building a new facility 10 times the size, still in my riding, just on more the west side of the city. So very excited about that. Now, I'll come to the recommendations that are in this report, given that prelude that I have made to this point. Recommendation 41 specifically talks about zero-emission vehicles and rebates for low and modest income individuals and families. Now, this is a program, according to the report, that was based on another program from California, and I think that it has great potential. Of course, one of the barriers, especially when you go back to the bell curve that I talked about earlier, if you're an innovator or an early adopter, you're paying more than the average person can for these technologies. If we can try to assist individuals to be able to access the technology sooner, we will hit that tipping point sooner. So I'm very glad to see that a recommendation is put in here that specifically tries to encourage and give access to individuals of lower or modest income in terms of rebates when they're looking to purchase a zero-emissions vehicle. There's also another within Recommendation 41, a reference to green cash for clunkers, which I can only assume is to provide people with money that goes towards green technologies if they trade in old vehicles that are notorious for being large emitters. There's also a rebate suggestion in Recommendation 41 for taxis and car sharing services. And the important thing about that, Mr. Speaker, is that they specifically say that these rebates should be stackable. So you don't have to choose between one and the other. Again, really trying to help individuals and businesses as it relates to taxis or car sharing to penetrate into this market. And then, of course, there's the educational programs that are also referenced in Recommendation 41 about educating the public on zero-emission vehicles, how to access them, what they're actually like driving, and what benefits they have to the environment. I also noticed in here that Recommendation 178 talks about a goal of 1 million EV parking stalls to be installed in apartments and condos throughout Canada. Again, another great recommendation. I asked my Bloc colleague earlier about Quebec's success, and the reality is that Quebec has had tremendous success in this. Quebec entered into an agreement back in, I believe it was 2006, with California and Ontario to develop the cap and trade model, which incentivized electrifying the grid, which put incentivization into transitioning away from fossil fuels. And Ontario, when Doug Ford came along, decided to get out of it. And in that short period of time, Mr. Speaker, since Doug Ford has been Premier, the difference between Ontario and Quebec as it relates to electrifying the grid and providing car charging stations is night and day. I recently drove with my wife through Quebec last summer, and it is almost impossible not to find an electric vehicle charging station once you enter into the province of Quebec, because they've been so progressive when it comes to ensuring that the infrastructure is there. And so I think that the federal government needs to take a lead and tell other provinces, you need to start being more like Quebec when it comes to electrifying the capacity to charge vehicles, because it's absolutely key if we're just about at that tipping point. Doug Ford and the rest of the premiers are going to find themselves in a lot of trouble very shortly once we hit that tipping point, and suddenly they realize that they don't have the capacity. And I would like to warn them in advance. I don't want to have to say I told you so, but I'd like to warn them in advance that this was all foreseeable years ago. And Quebec saw it. Ontario saw it. Ontario bailed. Quebec didn't. And Quebec is now ready for it, and will be even more ready as we get towards that tipping point. I also saw that Recommendation 179 specifically talks about EV requirements and putting them into the National Building Code. Why is this important? Most provinces in Canada rely on the National Building Code as its building code. Some provinces, like Ontario and Quebec, have their own building codes, but they're very heavily influenced by the National Building Code. Ensuring that within the National Building Code, we are telling people, we're telling contractors, when you're building a new house, you gotta put in the hard wiring for an EV station, even if it's not gonna be installed now. Running 10 gauge or 8 gauge wire, whatever's required for that at the construction phase, is a lot cheaper than asking a homeowner to do it retroactively after their house is being built. I live in a brand new condo it was brand new when I moved in 2015 in Ottawa. I almost fell out of my seat when I saw that they didn't have some capacity for electric vehicle charging within that condo, within that building, as are the vast majority of buildings in the downtown area of Ottawa and other municipalities throughout this province for that matter. We need to put it into the building code saying, when you're building a new building, you have to at least have the infrastructure, the hardwiring in place to ensure that we can deal with this when the time comes. And then I also noticed that recommendation 181 included EV charging installation for EV readiness of energy efficiency programs for older homes. Older homes in this country, especially those 40 years and older, but a lot of them only have 60 amp services that are running into their homes, Mr. Speaker. Sorry, Mr. Speaker. And the reality is that a 60 amp service realistically can't handle what is required. So putting incentivizations in place to helping people with older homes be able to upgrade those to 100 or 200 amp services will be beneficial in the long run when it comes to EVs. So I'm very glad to see all this very important work in there regarding EVs. And I really hope that the government picks up on some of these recommendations because I think that they are very meaningful. I don't know how the committee came to them. I don't know if it was, Liberals or Bloc or the Bloc and the NDP that pushed these through. My sense is that the Conservatives probably didn't have a ton to do with it, with all due respect, but I am very glad to see these in there, and I certainly will reference this back when I'm talking to my government about these recommendations. Finally, Mr. Speaker, in the last few minutes that I have, I want to talk about a recommendation. I have recommendation 6, but I think it may have been slightly different, but anyways, I'll read it to you. It says, regarding fossil fuel subsidies, that we divert subsidies from the fossil fuel sector towards the development of renewable and efficient energy sources while supporting those most impacted by this transition. I think that this is absolutely key. And if there's one criticism that I have of my government, Mr. Speaker, because despite the fact that many people in this House think that I am just here to be the mouthpiece of my government in this House, if there's one, don't nod your head, Mr. Speaker, you're not supposed to have an opinion on this. If there's one thing that I'm critical of, it's our speed at which we have been removing fossil fuel subsidies. I know we've been doing it. We've been doing a lot of work on it. We've slowly been getting there. I understand that there are always circumstances that create scenarios that make things harder to do with great haste, but I believe that we should not be subsidizing the fossil fuel industry full stop. That is my position on it. That's my position that has been for a number of years on it. That's my own personal position, and I tell you that I continue to make that known to those in charge on this side of the House. That's my position. Now, having said that, the NDP will quite often say that we've actually increased fossil fuel subsidies. And I might even get a question on this. But I would like to say, Mr. Speaker, where we have increased money is helping certain regions of the country deal with orphan oil wells. Now, I know, and I don't disagree, that those that created the wells should have been responsible to deal with them at the end of life. But guess what? In many cases, they didn't. And so it falls on somebody to be responsible, and in this case, that somebody has to be the federal government and provincial government working together. So, I do not consider money that is being used to deal with orphan wells that have been completely abandoned and there's no ability to create a recourse with those responsible. I do not consider that to be a fossil fuel subsidy. I consider that being the right societal thing to do, regardless of who has to pay for it. If there is any way to go back and get the proper funding from those responsible to pay for it, I will be completely supportive of that. But I will not just stand by and watch an orphan oil well sit there and not insist that we do something about it. So I don't include dealing with orphan oil wells as a fossil fuel subsidy. So to that end, we have been moving in the right direction. I want to move faster in that direction. I see that this recommendation specifically talks about moving there quickly. It talks about using those funds specifically to support those most impacted in this transition. There are a ton of new opportunities and new technologies out there. I think that the government could do very well by helping those transition into working in these new clean technologies. There are tremendous opportunities in the future. I am not here in any way to advocate that we abandon the sectors of our country that have supported this country for so long. I'm rather here to say, let's do our part in helping them transition. And I think that this recommendation is good, very good in that regard, and it points us in the right direction. So thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the movers of this motion for allowing me to talk about this very important discussion today. And good news, Mr. Speaker, I do plan to stay here for the next 10 minutes to answer any questions that my colleagues have.
Well, firstly, I just want to apologize to the member. I was just agreeing that I can understand why members in the House would think that you are a spokesperson for the government. So that's just one thing. And secondly, I'm waiting for my invite to see the battery recycling organization, because those complicated battery packs are, I'm sure, are complicated to work on, let alone recycle. So questions and comments? Question et commentaire. The honourable member for Calgary Rocky Ridge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I listened to the member's speech, and I heard him at the very end acknowledge he didn't name a province, but it was pretty clear he was talking about Alberta, and thanked it for supporting the country for so long. And I think that I'd like to make sure that we do identify or be clear about which province he was talking about. And that was quite an acknowledgement from this member, that the industry that this government has attacked and vilified, and from time to time actually negatively characterized the entire province, to acknowledge that it's the extent to which it's been financially underwriting the public services that the entire country relies on. So I do thank him for that. But I wonder if he would maybe comment on the amendment to the motion that was made today, and the Blue Seal system that has been proposed by the opposition, and does he agree that we should move toward recognizing credentials, and will he support the amendment then, and get this recommendation before the government?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
If I left anything to wonder, Mr. Speaker, I was certain, I think that a lot of what I was talking about was Alberta. I wouldn't say Alberta exclusively, but indeed, Alberta and the fossil fuel sector has supported this country for a very long time. Although I am very much in favor of moving away from fossil fuels, I am not here to say that I would turn my back on those that have helped this country for so long. And indeed, I agree with that recommendation that specifically talks about helping the transition so that Alberta can and those other affected regions can see new opportunities and benefit from those new opportunities. With respect to his question, I can't support the amendment because the amendment says that we delete everything else beforehand. But do I support the idea of the Blue Seal program? Listen, it's a great program. We need a lot, and I must admit, I didn't hear the entire amendment. I don't have a copy of it. But if it is what I understand it to be, I think that there are a lot of individuals with skills in this country that need to be accredited. We need people working in this country, and everything that we can do to ensure that those that have the same skills to the standards of Canada have the opportunities to participate in those workforces.
Questions and comments, the Honourable Member for Joliette. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would sincerely like to thank the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for his speech. It was an excellent speech from beginning to end. He thought a great deal about it, and it's heartwarming to see that the report of the committee that we adopted together as a group, I'm pleased to see it being debated today, especially concerning the proposals concerning electric vehicles. We worked across party lines to get to this, and so it's very heartwarming. There were also a number of proposals concerning the fight against tax evasion. We worked together on that as well in committee, and the Honourable Member for Pontiac did excellent work on that. Now, here's my question. Is something that I noticed in the Parliamentary Secretary's speech concerned battery recycling, as you mentioned as well, Mr. Speaker. Now, often we say, well, electrical vehicles, it takes a lot of resources to make the batteries. And I'd like to hear more from the Honourable Member concerning recycling. Is it economically viable? And where is it at? Is the industry at its height?
Thank you for that question to the member from the block. And it certainly is economically viable. It's to the point where there's a company in my constituency called Li-Cycle that is building a new facility that is 10 times the size of the existing facility. So it's clearly something that is economical, because this is just going to be a booming industry. The reality is, and this is what I was trying to say in my speech, is that when you Talk about fossil fuels to run vehicles. We're extracting fossil fuel from the ground, we're burning it. When we're done burning it, it's pollution in the air, and that's the end of story. We extract more. With electric vehicles, we have companies, and I mean, this is a new company. They're just at the beginning of the technology, and they're already able to recycle 97% of the battery. They're taking the battery, ripping it down to its core elements, and then giving it to the battery manufacturing plants that are building brand new batteries out of it. So although that lithium needs to be mined the original time, every time after that, that same lithium can go on to serve many vehicles as the recycling process gives the opportunity and gives the ingredients to make new batteries.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. L'honorable député de Edmonton.
The honourable member for Edmonton Griesbach.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my colleague for bringing up the condition of orphan wells and across the country, but in particular in my home province of Alberta. It's no secret that these orphan wells, some of them dating back many decades, are a huge pollutant. And Indigenous communities are the communities that are the #1 impacted by these sites. I grew up in an area in northeast Alberta, just north of the Coal Lake oil sands, and in this location, we have some of the largest number of abandoned and orphan wells. It's been known by the government ever since the first orphan well happened that these sites would need remediation. Why didn't the government take action to ensure that the companies put aside money to ensure that these projects were actually remediated in a proper way, and that our environmental laws allowed for these kinds of projects to actually have the enforcement that's necessary to hold these companies accountable? I agree that today taxpayers are stuck with the problem, unfortunately, that the years of delay and years of mismanagement and the kind of ignoring of the oil sector's misdealings have presented. Why not ensure that the corporations moving forward actually are held to account and put the resources aside to clean them up themselves?
Parliamentary Secretary.
That is an absolutely excellent question, and I wish I knew the answer to it, and I don't. I was in municipal government before coming here, and from the minute that we built a brand new building, we already started building a reserve fund to deal with the challenges that the building would face years and decades down the road. Why on earth we would allow a company to, drill into the ground? If you go into a municipality and you want to do a site plan, you want to, build a new building, you have to give the municipality a deposit on your site plan. If you don't deliver on what your site plan says you'll do, the municipality can come in and pay for it. Why on earth that wasn't set up for oil wells, I don't know. I can respect the fact that the times must have been different then. Who knows what the circumstances were like, but I think in hindsight, it was just not the right thing to do of all successive government or all previous governments that have dealt with this.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The honourable member for Nepean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad that my colleague, while speaking, brought up the issue of the batteries and the importance of it for the electrical vehicle industry. Not just that, I think is also a very important thing for the energy storage, which makes the renewable power generations like solar and wind much more viable going forward. I should congratulate him that adjacent to his riding, he has got one of the biggest battery plant coming up, and in his riding, Lee Cycle has started a processing facility, recycling unit. I would like to ask him whether he agrees with me that weakest link in the entire ecosystem of battery manufacturing is actually mining of the critical minerals that is required, that goes into the manufacture of batteries. And the federal government has entered into agreement with various provinces, like with Ontario table, where we try to align the resources, the timelines, and the regulatory process to fasten up the mining projects. But does he agree with me that that's the weakest link, and we need a sort of Team Canada approach to make sure that we get the real mining companies start extracting and delivering the critical mines that is required for the battery industries?
The honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, first of all, I just say I appreciate the question. That Lie Cycle is in my riding. However, the new plant that's going to open is in a conservative riding next door to me. So I think it's something that both Liberals and Conservatives should be celebrating. But I would say, to his question, the weakest link is in the mining, and he's absolutely right. And we've all seen those videos on Facebook. We've all seen the reports of the conditions in which individuals are required to mine these products and these minerals. We're rich in terms of our resources with respect to those. We have standards in this country that will ensure that it is not one of the weakest links, and I think that there's great opportunity there for Canada moving into the future. So I certainly, think that we need to establish that as soon as possible. I think that our government is working on it. And the only other thing that I would say is that, when we talk about these technologies, they're evolving very quickly, and there are new opportunities that are coming along. We are just in the earliest phases of this, and I think that as time goes on, it's really going to take off, and we're going to see incredible progress.
Quick question and response to the honourable member for Sandwich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Speaker. I'm sorry, I'm trying to make this as quick as possible. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary has opened up a personal reflection on his deep commitment around climate action. I saw that in his face when we debated here at an emergency debate October 2018, when the IPCC said the future of humanity is at stake. We have very little time. And I put to the honourable member, we're in no better position now than we were in October 2018 because we have not taken the immediate required action to ensure we have any hope of holding to 1.5 degrees or 2. So as uncomfortable as it is, I would ask him to rethink the commitment to continuing to say this government is on the right track, because this government continues to boost fossil fuel production, this government continues to promote building the Trans Mountain Pipeline, and this government is living in a world of cognitive dissonance, believing it's doing the right thing while it keeps its foot on the accelerator to climate hell. I'm sorry, but that's the reality.
We are out of time, but I will allow the member to answer. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
I do remember that debate vividly. I sat where she is. She was right across the aisle from me, Mr. Speaker, and it was a very emotional and passionate debate on all sides of the House. I would do anything that I can in my power to expedite this even faster. I realize that the UN recently just said we have to make significant changes by 2040, if I recall what was just released. Anything that I can do, I'm more than willing to work with my colleague on that and push our government, and any government for that matter, to work harder and faster on this. Thank you.
Continuing debate, reprise.